Hello everyone, this is Andrew from Crown Academy of English. Today's lesson is about the modal verb must, and we're going to look at the form, use and meaning. So, must is a modal verb. The pronunciation is must. And in this lesson you will learn the form of must and the different uses and meanings. So we will look at obligation and necessity, deductions and conclusions, rules and laws, invitations and encouragement, and finally criticism. Okay, so let's start with the form. The affirmative. We have the subject, followed by must, followed by the base form of the verb. So here we are. I must go, you must go, he must go, she must go, it must go, we must go, you must go, and they must go. So you can see it's quite easy. The modal verb is always the same spelling, must. The base form is always the same, and so it is only the subject that changes. The negative. The full form is subject, followed by must not, followed by the base form. So it's exactly the same, except we add the word not. Okay? So I will read the first three. I must not go, you must not go, he must not go, etc. We also have a contracted form. So here we have the subject, followed by mustn't. So must not becomes contracted, and it becomes N''T, followed by the base form. I mustn't go, you mustn't go, he mustn't go, etc. Okay? Finally, the question form. So we invert the order, so we change the order. We have the modal verb first, followed by the subject, followed by the base form, and then if we are writing it, we write a question mark at the end. So here we go. Must I go? Must you go? Must he go? Must she go? Must it go? Must we go? Must you go? Must they go? Okay? So that's the form. Now let's look at the meaning and use of the modal verb must. Obligation and necessity in the present or future. So we use must to describe strong obligation or necessity in the present or future. Okay? Examples. The teacher says, you must answer all of the questions. You must answer all of the questions. So here we are expressing an obligation or necessity. Okay? There is no choice here. It is compulsory to answer all of the questions. Mark says, I must walk the dog when I get home. I must walk the dog when I get home. So it is necessary that I walk the dog when I get home. Okay, it's very important. So we use must when something is very important. Okay, an obligation. It's an important job I must not forget, for example. And a third example, The manager says, I must talk to you about your prices. And the supplier says, yes, of course. Okay, so the manager has something very important to talk about, the prices. So I must talk to you about something. Very common on the telephone in a business meeting. Okay, and if there is something important, an important subject that you would like to discuss with someone, you say, I must talk to you about something. Now, the same thing, but in the past. Obligation and necessity. Warning, be careful. In fact, we use had to describe strong obligation or necessity in the past. We do not use must. Okay, so this is important. This is why I have separated the past from the present and the future. So this is an exception. Use had to. Had is, of course, the past form of the verb have. So the form is subject followed by had to followed by the base form of the verb. Okay, let's look at some examples. Jane says, I had to help Mark with his homework yesterday. Okay, so we know it's in the past because we're saying yesterday. I had to help Mark with his homework yesterday. Okay, so this means it was necessary to help Mark with his homework yesterday. It was important. There was an obligation. Sarah had to study very hard for the exam. Sarah had to study very hard for the exam. Okay, so we have used had to. So we know that this exam is in the past. It's implied. Okay, it's not explicitly mentioned in the sentence, but the fact that we have used had to, we know when we hear this that the exam was in the past. Perhaps it was last year. Perhaps it was last week. We don't know, but we know the exam is from the past. Okay? Had to. So this is for the obligation and necessity in the past. Now, let's look at deductions and conclusions in the present. So, when we analyze facts about a situation, we often use must to express deductions and conclusions from those facts. So, we hear or we read some facts about something, and then we come to a conclusion. And when we express that conclusion, we use must. Let me give you an example. So Mark says, I got up at 4 a.m. this morning. I got up at 4 a.m. this morning. Okay. So Sarah says, oh wow, you must be tired. You must be tired. So here are the facts. This is the facts about the situation. And then from those facts, Sarah comes to a conclusion or a deduction. So basically, Sarah here, and Mark says, yes, I am tired. And here he is, very tired. So this, Sarah is saying, oh, I am sure that you are tired. That is the meaning of this. You are tired. I am sure that you are tired. Okay, that is the conclusion and the deduction. Because Mark got up at 4 o'clock, very early. So now Mark must be tired. But be careful, this is not obligation. This is not saying that Mark is obliged to be tired, or there's no necessity, but it means certain. It's a certainty. And Mark agrees, yes, you're right, I am tired. Okay, so it's a conclusion based on some facts. But the meaning is not obligation or necessity. Here we're talking about deductions and conclusions. Another example. Sarah asks, did David pass his exam? Jane says, yes, he passed. And Sarah replies, fantastic, he must be delighted. He must be delighted. So again, Sarah, when she finds out that David passed his exam, the conclusion is that David is delighted. So Sarah is certain, or fairly certain, quite certain, that David is delighted. He must be delighted. Okay, so it's the conclusion from the information. Now let's look at deductions and conclusions from the past. It's very similar, but we use must have followed by the past participle. Okay, so it's the past participle. It's not the base form, it's the past participle to express deductions and conclusions from the past. Example. Mark says, Jane didn't eat anything yesterday. Okay, so we can see this is in the past. Didn't eat. This is the past simple negative. Sarah asks, why not? And Mark replies, she must have been ill. She must have been ill. Okay, must have followed by the past participle. This is the past participle of the verb to be. So this is a conclusion from something that happened in the past, yesterday. This is the conclusion of why Jane didn't eat anything. Okay, so Mark is saying, well, this means I am fairly certain that the reason is because Jane was ill. That's what this means. It's conclusion from the past. Example 2. Why is Mark late? And Jane says, he must have missed the bus. He must have missed the bus. Okay, so this is a deduction or conclusion from the past. Okay, that Mark perhaps missed the bus, or certainly Mark missed the bus. Okay, so that's what this means. It's almost like a hypothesis. It's a theory about an explanation. Okay, it's a proposed explanation based on the facts. He must have missed the bus. There's no other explanation. Jane must have been ill. I can't think of another reason. Okay? Rules and laws. We use must in notices and signs indicating rules, regulations, and laws. So here's an example. Passengers must arrive at the airport at least 2 hours before departure. Okay, you often see this written on tickets. Passengers must arrive at the airport at least 2 hours before departure. So the meaning here, this is coming back to the meaning of obligation and necessity, but in the context of rules and laws, official rules and laws. Hard hats must be worn at all times. So a hard hat, it's like a very hard plastic helmet that you wear on a building site. Often the color is yellow. Okay? Must be worn. Notice that this sentence is in the passive. It's the passive voice. So the form is must be followed by the past participle. Hard hats must be worn. So this is the past participle of wear, W-E-A-R, at all times. Bags must be placed under the seat. Under the seat. So this is a train, obviously. This is a train. This is the seat. So bags must be placed under the seat. So here we're using must, and we're expressing obligation and its rules and regulations. Again, this is in yes, this is the passive again. Must be followed by the past participle. Placed. Okay? Bags must be placed under the seat. And we often use the passive. I don't want to talk in detail about the passive, but we often use the passive for notices and signs. Why? Well, it's because it is a more neutral form of the language. It is less direct. It is less aggressive. Because of course we could have on the sign, another choice would be, you must wear a hard hat at all times. And that would be the active. That would be the active voice. But that is more aggressive, more direct. Here we could also use the active. We could say, you must place your bags under the seat. But again, that is too direct. That the language is too direct, it's too aggressive. So we avoid that by using the passive. So we don't say you must, we say the bags must be placed. Hard hats must be worn. Okay? But the important thing for this lesson is just understanding that we use must to express the obligation on a sign and notice. Okay? And we use must not to describe what is not permitted. So we use the negative form of must to describe things that are forbidden. Example, students must not take mobile phones into the exam room. Okay, must not. So this is the negative form. Members of staff must not park in the customer car park. Okay? And both of these are the active, but notice that we have used the third person. Again, this is less aggressive. It is less direct. We don't write, you must not take mobile phones into the exam room, because the second person is very direct. So we avoid it by using the third person. Students must not take mobile phones into the exam room. Okay? The message is the same, but it's the tone that changes. And invitations and encouragement. We use must to make a polite invitation or to encourage someone to do something. And a very common example is this. You must come to visit me in London. You must come to visit me in London. So we often use must when we are inviting someone to visit us. So it's in fact, it's a polite invitation. We're not saying this is not an obligation, it's not a necessity. So don't think that we are giving someone an order. No, it's the opposite. In fact, it's an expression. So this is actually very polite. You must come to visit me in London. And Mark says, this cake is delicious. You must try it. So here Mark is encouraging someone to do something. He's encouraging you to eat or to try the cake. Okay, so it's a polite way of making a suggestion. Okay, it's a very enthusiastic way of suggesting something or inviting someone. Finally, criticism. So we use the question form of must to criticize someone. So Jane says, must you always leave the windows open? Must you always leave the windows open? And Mark says, I'm sorry, I always forget to close them. Okay, so Jane is basically, she's annoyed. She's annoyed because the windows are open and Mark never closes them. So strictly this is a question, but it's not really a question that she's not really expecting a reply. It's just a different way of complaining or to criticize Mark. Must you? And Jane says, must you always leave the light on? Must you always leave the light on? So she's annoyed because Mark has left the light on. So she's criticizing him by saying, must you always leave the light on? It's a criticism. And Mark says, I'm sorry. Okay? Poor Mark. He's always doing things wrong. And Jane is never happy. Okay, so there we are. That's the end. That's the last use of the word must. Hope you enjoyed it. Don't forget to check out my website. There's lots of useful articles and resources on there. And you can also get a private lesson or to join our IELTS course. Okay? And here are some other videos which you might be interested in.